So I had hoped to get all of these up on the same day, but as it turns out, life happens, and so that didn't happen. Hopefully I can get a few more parts of this lecture series up today, and hopefully I can get up, record and get up a few more lecture series this weekend. I'm really far behind with them, and I want to get them up before you really begin focusing your attention and energies on composing your final portfolio for the semester. Because there might be some things going on in the lectures that will help you compose your reflective introduction, or maybe they might even help you as you are revising the documents that go into that assignment. So with that said, I'll just launch into the next part. Okay? With new criticism, it makes sense to begin with an account of Cleanth Brooks, or Wimsatt and Beardsley. With structuralism, it is said that one should begin with Ferdinand de Saussure, and we did. With deconstruction, it is difficult not to begin, or at least to allude to, Jacques Derrida. With psychoanalysis, even if you choose or have more sympathy for a Lacanian approach, which we didn't really cover much in class, although there were some good papers that took up Lacan in their readings of Mrs. Dalloway. Although we might have sympathy for Lacan, Sigmund Freud is still the father, as it were, of psychoanalysis. There would be no Lacanian symbolic or imaginary or mirror stage or the gaze or the unconscious is structured like a language without Freud. But what about feminism? I've heard it said that one of the virtues of feminism is that it does not have a father, or for that matter, a mother. The very idea of one primary text or oeuvre or authority to which one should return in order to measure the accuracy or interest or workability or value of one's own research or politics is, as the metaphor of Derrida being the father of deconstruction, or Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, suggests, a patriarchal value, part of the very socio-cultural framework that feminism seeks to combat, challenge, critique, and or subvert. But in order to teach the connection between feminism and literary criticism, we do have to begin somewhere. Taking our cue from Parker, in our textbook, it might be a good idea to distinguish between three categories that give us some sort of handle, although it's not always the most accurate tool or precise tool for dealing with the history of feminist thought in politics. Okay, so if you turn to 149, Parker writes, quote, "Feminist debates about identity take us to a rough historical outline that loosely tracks feminism through a series of three waves." Those familiar with feminism probably saw this coming, right? First wave feminism, beginning with Wollstonecraft's, Mary Wollstonecraft's arguments for women's education, focusing on establishing women's rights, such as the right to own property and the right to vote, officially recognized in the United Kingdom partly in 1918 and fully in 1928, and in the United States in 1920. Second wave feminism defined itself along a broader cultural agenda, beginning in the 1960s. While in practical politics, second wave feminism often concentrated on achieving equal rights like first wave feminism, the theoretical movements most associated with second wave feminism concentrated more on describing or even celebrating the distinctiveness and specialness, it's a kind of patronizing word, of women, sometimes under rubrics, such rubrics as cultural feminism, which claimed a women's culture that was kinder, gentler, and more peaceful than the dominant culture, or difference feminism, which was less interested in equal rights than in establishing women's difference and superiority. This account isn't, we'll leave aside the inaccuracies for now, but we'll just keep going. Second wave feminism often focused on a sense of sisterhood and shared identity among all women. That's more accurate. But to some feminists, that sense that all women shared the same identity came to ring false. For that reason, by the late 1970s and early 1980s, many feminists reacted against second wave feminism so that a third wave feminism developed. Third wave feminism objected to second wave feminism as essentialist, or we shouldn't say always essentialist, sometimes essentialist, and sought instead to build a feminism that focused more on the variety of women, building coalitions across racial and national boundaries, and often engaging with the anti-essentialist impulses of deconstruction. In practice, most feminist critics and theorists today do not define themselves entirely through this or that wave, he's right there, but draw on all three waves to pursue non-essentialist political and cultural agendas. End quote. Parker will go on to write, or does go on to write, that, quote, the movement from second to third wave feminism roughly parallels the history of feminist literary criticism. We'll come back to this claim. How else might we understand these waves? Linda Nicholson, editor of the collection, I have it actually here with me, The Second Wave. It's a pretty brilliant collection, actually. Collection of essays from Simone de Beauvoir to sort of contemporary theorists and critics. Editor of this collection, she begins her introduction to that volume with the following paragraph, and I might try to copy. I know I always promise to put stuff in the descriptions, and I never do, but maybe I'll actually remember to do it this time. Anyway, she begins the following paragraph. Sorry, I feel like I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me. Quote, "Is the second wave a useful concept? Scholars have raised important questions about this distinction, first wave, second wave, as a way of organizing the history of feminism. When does each wave begin, and when does it end? What activities and what social groups are excluded by this distinction? What countries does it or does it not apply to? These are important questions and merit discussion. Nevertheless, I believe that something important occurred in the 1960s that is still spinning itself out. That occurrence was a new intensity in many societies in the degree of reflection given to gender relations. The political movements that came into being in the 1960s meant that a radical questioning of gender roles was being carried out not only by isolated scholars or marginalized groups, but in front of and with the attention of many national publics. The consequence has been a major restructuring of institutions worldwide. Something happened in the 1960s in ways of thinking about gender that continues to shape public and private life." End quote. This is the context in which to read, understand, appreciate, and learn from some of the most influential second-wave feminist criticism, literary criticism, and theory written in the mid to late 20th century, and still being written too. I think that's a fallacy that second to third wave feminism describes an evolution, right? That third wave feminism is necessarily more nuanced or more evolved than second wave. But as Parker says, they overlap, and it's oversimplifies things to think about it as a progression, even though, again, it's more like a sort of rough tool, right? An imprecise tool that gives us some sort of handle on differences among feminism. Okay, but anyway, sorry, that's an aside. What sort of literary critical projects emerge around this time, or are still, in some sense, in circulation? As Parker points out, a great deal of what he calls early feminist literary criticism focuses on, quote, images of women, end quote, a point he draws from Toril Moi. This category of criticism focuses on the patterns of representation or misrepresentation in literature. More contemporary criticism focuses on images of women in film, music, television, web series, and so on. While it has even video games, right, comic books. While it has become somewhat out of fashion to judge a work of literature's aesthetic or political value based on whether or not it has what Netflix might call strong female or strong women characters, or not, as Parker suggests, The study of representations of women is a bit more flexible, varied, and complex than this. It is not simply a question of whether or not a television series or a novel has good women, it's Parker's phrase, but a question of learning how to ask questions that get you to observe media and art from a different angle of vision. It's Woolf's phrase. And moreover, a question of learning how to notice, sorry, I lost my place, learning how to notice patterns of representation you may not have noticed before. This can be actually incredibly eye-opening if the first time you ever notice rather disturbing or maybe good or enlightening patterns in the representation of women or any other group. Or if you have noticed patterns before, images of women criticism, if you have noticed patterns, images of women criticism, as Parker calls it, offers critical tools for analyzing and evaluating those patterns, and perhaps even theorizing and generalizing some implications, cultural implications, political implications, ethical implications, even aesthetic implications of those patterns. So what sort of questions does this kind of criticism ask, and what sort of things does it try to point out or get us to notice? A rather famous test offers us 3 questions, right? And initially, it might sound more funny than insightful, but in some sense, the point is the very fact that it is so simple that makes it so powerful. In a 1985 comic strip entitled "The Rule," part of Alison Bechdel's series Dykes to Watch Out For, one of Bechdel's characters tells a friend of hers that she has 3 basic requirements for determining whether or not she will see a movie, like if it's worth her time or not. In question form, these requirements are: first, are there at least 2 women in the film? Second, do the women ever talk to one another? Do they have a conversation? And 3, is that conversation about something other than a man? Simple, right? And somewhat funny is the point, but it's less funny when you actually start noticing how few novels and films actually pass this test, let alone how many barely pass the test, right? Because even if a film barely passes it, still doesn't really make it feminist by any stretch of the imagination, right? Doesn't necessarily mean that the representation of women in the film is not misrepresentations. But of course, images of women criticism goes a bit more in depth than this, asking how are women portrayed, from whose perspective, how much interest is paid to what they think, desire, and do. Does the scope of what they think, desire, and do extend beyond issues involving men or having children? What sort of future is open to them? How much of her past or women's pasts are we privy to, and from whose perspective? How much narrative space, right? Think of structuralism here. How much narrative space is devoted to them? Are men set in opposition to women? Are women set in opposition to men? Are they a stumbling block to men, or vice versa? What is the relationship between the men and women in the story? Do women function as independent characters, or are they merely channels through which men develop relations with one another? If a woman stands out as out of sync with cultural norms in the story, how is she portrayed? As adorable, as quirky, as neurotic, as in need of fixing, as incomplete, until she's brought into alignment with cultural norms? If we were talking about film or television, we might also ask, how are women blocked, dressed, centered, or decentered? With whom are we as spectators enjoined to identify? With whose gaze are we enjoined to identify? With women? With men? Both? How much movement are women given? Which directions can they move in? Are they static? Are they framed? Framed by windows, by doors, by the camera lens? Or do they move? Do they cross thresholds and borders? These are just a small handful of questions, many of which Laura Mulvey teaches us to ask in her seminal essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, published in 1975, in which Parker addresses, in our textbook, we read some of these pages together, from pages 166 to 69. I wanted to write out an example, one of my favorite examples, to try to demonstrate this. Might be a bit unfair because I stopped watching the show several years ago. But on Fox, there's a show called Bones. I don't know how many of you watch it, but it's about a forensic anthropologist whose nickname is Bones. She's very famous. She's apparently the most respected, most intelligent forensic anthropologist in the country or in the world in the show. She specializes in bones, right? Reading bones. That's what she specializes in. And on top of that, she's also a best-selling crime novelist, a fact that is often forgotten about in later seasons of the show. But anyway, the premise of the show, like so many premises on television, is that she is paired up with an FBI agent, right? And they solve crimes together, right? She specializes in reading the bones. She helps solve the crime. They catch the bad guy together. So it's a lot like Castle, or a lot like Psych, or a lot like even Almost Human. Anyway, what interests me is the title, Bones. Because although in the description I just gave you, she what is her name in the show? Temperance Brennan, I think, is the Dr. Temperance Brennan. I may be getting her name wrong, the character's name wrong. But although she may seem, given my description, of what Netflix again would call a strong woman character, financially successful, intellectually successful, academically successful, financially, I might have said that already, financially successful, aesthetically successful, right? And successful in catching bad guys every week. Nevertheless, the title of the show could be read as not just referring to her interest, right, the bones, right, the remnants of humans left behind, and not just to her nickname, right, her FBI agent partner calls her Bones, but also to the fact that despite all that success, she is, according to the show, framed over and over again as abnormal, incomplete. She doesn't believe in God. She does not initially desire to be married. She does not want children. She sees monogamy as a cultural construct, right? And despite that also being part of the strongness of this character, that is always framed in exchanges with other characters and gestures and looks on their faces as almost pathological, something in need of fixing. And right, so over the course of the show, over the course of the series, right, the sort of moral narrative that the story plays is the way in which to bring this woman, right, incredibly successful on her own, sexually independent, into alignment with cultural norms, right? So I don't want to give spoilers in case you're interested in the show, but it's somewhat disturbing when you take a step back and see that despite being the main character of the show, she's framed again and again as not just sort of quirky, but as abnormal, not counter-normative, not revolutionary, but abnormal and in need of fixing, right? In need of learning a lesson about humans behave in every episode, despite the fact that she's an anthropologist, despite the fact that she studies culture for a living. She again and again is put in situations where she misrecognizes cultural codes and cues, and so is made to look ridiculous. And we, the audience, are supposed to laugh, or is supposed to laugh. So, anyway, I don't mean to say it's not a charming show. Sometimes it can be, and I certainly, like I said, maybe being unfair to it, given I haven't watched it in a long time, but I thought it might be a useful example, just to see how one pays attention to how women are represented, especially a woman who is purportedly supposed to be strong, right, and successful from the very get-go of a television show. Okay, I'm going to pause here and come back around to another form of what we might think of as second wave literary or cultural criticism. Or maybe a better way to put it, just one mode of doing feminist literary and or cultural criticism.